Imagine being dragged from your home, accused of something you never did. Now imagine it's 780. Your life, your reputation, everything you hold dear hangs by a thread. What happens when the scales of justice are not just tilted, but completely broken, especially for women? Number 9. Women's testimony was worth less than a whisper. Picture this: a courtroom in 780 AD. Not like the courtrooms you see on TV today, with stern judges and meticulous evidence. This was a world operating on different rules deeply etched by tradition, religion, and the very structure of society. When a woman stepped forward to speak, her words carried a weight far lighter than those of a man. It wasn't just a slight difference. It was a fundamental imbalance that could decide her fate when a false accusation struck. Consider the legal landscape of the early medieval period in Europe. It wasn't a unified system. Laws varied from region to region, from the territories influenced by Frankish law to those still clinging to vestiges of Roman legal thought, and even the evolving Anglo-Saxon traditions. However, one common thread, a thick, undeniable rope, ran through most of these systems: the subordinate position of women. They were often considered dependents, legally under the guardianship of a father, a brother, or a husband. This wasn't just a social custom. It was embedded in the very fabric, not the word, but the very practical application of the law. When an accusation, perhaps of theft, slander, or even something as serious as poisoning, was leveled against a woman, her ability to defend herself was crippled from the outset by the devaluation of her testimony. A man's oath, his sworn word, particularly if he was a free man of good standing, held significant weight. It was seen as a direct appeal to God, and false swearing was a grave offense. But a woman's oath, often it wasn't enough. In some legal traditions, women were simply not permitted to testify in court at all, especially not against a man. Their words, in the eyes of the law, were considered too susceptible to emotion, too easily swayed, or simply not as binding as a man's solemn declaration. Imagine a woman named Aethelflaed, living in a small Anglo-Saxon village. Her neighbor, a man named Wulfstan, falsely accuses her of stealing one of his cows. Aethelflaed knows she's innocent. She saw Wulfstan's cow wander off into the woods days ago. She might even know someone who saw it happen. But when she tries to explain, to offer her account, the weight of her words is diminished. Wulfstan, being a man, a landowner, and perhaps known in the community, has his testimony taken far more seriously. His word, even if false, carries authority. Aethelflaed's, even if true, is often dismissed or seen as insufficient to counteract a man's claim. This isn't to say that all women were silenced completely in all cases. In some specific circumstances, often related to matters within the household or involving other women, their testimony might have been accepted. However, when it came to a serious accusation, particularly one that pitted a woman against a man, the legal system was heavily stacked against her. The assumption was often that a woman required a male representative, a guardian or a champion, to speak for her, to vouch for her, or even to fight on her behalf in a trial by combat. Her own voice, her own truth was deemed insufficient. The ramifications of this legal bias were devastating. If a woman couldn't effectively present her defense, if her denials were seen as less credible, she stood a much higher chance of being found guilty, regardless of the truth. A false accusation, already a terrifying ordeal, became an almost insurmountable hurdle when the accused's very voice was muted by the law. The justice system, such as it was, placed an unfair burden on women, demanding them to prove their innocence without the most fundamental tool, the power of their own word. This structural weakness meant that many women, innocent of any wrongdoing, could find themselves stripped of their reputation, property, and freedom. all because their testimony was little more than a whisper in a world that only truly listened to men. This fundamental inequality left them profoundly vulnerable to malicious and baseless claims. Number 8. Trial by ordeal was a terrifying lottery. When logic and human testimony failed, or were deemed insufficient, the legal systems of 780 had often turned to what was called the ordeal. This wasn't a debate in a courtroom. It was a direct appeal to divine judgment. The idea was that God, being all-knowing and just, would intervene to reveal the truth, saving the innocent and condemning the guilty. For a woman facing a false accusation, the ordeal was less a path to justice and more a terrifying lottery often rigged against her. There were several forms of ordeal, but two were particularly common and grim: the ordeal of hot iron and the ordeal of cold water. Imagine being Aethelflaed again, accused of stealing the cow, and now the community, perhaps after a failed attempt at compurgation, decides she must undergo an ordeal to prove her innocence. In the ordeal of hot iron, a woman would be forced to carry a heated piece of iron, often glowing red, for a certain distance, usually 3 paces. Her hand would then be bandaged and sealed. After 3 days, the bandage would be removed and the wound examined. If the hand was clean and healing, she was declared innocent. If it was festering or showed no signs of healing, she was guilty. This was less about physical evidence and more about divine intervention. The expectation was that God would protect the innocent from harm or miraculously heal them. But in reality, wounds from hot iron almost always festered without modern medical care, making it a near certainty of guilt, particularly for someone who was already stressed, perhaps malnourished, and certainly terrified. The ordeal of cold water was equally chilling. The accused, often with ropes tied around her, would be lowered into a body of water, a lake, a river, or a large vat that had been blessed by a priest. The belief was that pure water, being an element of God, would reject the guilty. If the accused sank, they were considered innocent, as the water accepted them. If they floated, they were guilty, as the water had repelled them. This ordeal was especially insidious because a person's ability to sink or float could be influenced by many factors: body density, air trapped in clothes, panic. A woman perhaps dressed in heavy garments, already in a state of terror, might easily float, thus condemning her, regardless of her actual guilt or innocence. For women, these ordeals were particularly terrifying. They were often physically weaker than men, less accustomed to harsh physical trials, and more susceptible to the psychological toll of such public humiliation and pain. Furthermore, the ordeal was often preceded by a period of fasting and prayer, which would further weaken an individual. There was also the pervasive belief that a woman's weaker nature made her more prone to temptation or to succumbing to evil influences, thus subtly influencing how her performance in an ordeal might be interpreted. Church, which oversaw many of these ordeals, truly believed in their divine nature, but in practice these trials were brutal and incredibly unfair. An innocent woman, faced with a false accusation, had to rely on a literal miracle to clear her name. There was no room for legal defense, for presenting witnesses, or for logical argument. Her body became the battlefield, and her fate was left to a process that offered little hope and a high probability of severe injury, disfigurement, or even death, all under the guise of divine judgment. This system, rooted in superstition and physical endurance rather than any semblance of due process, rendered women almost entirely powerless against false accusations. Their physical vulnerability became their legal undoing, trapping them in a system where truth and justice were often irrelevant. Number 7. Compurgation demanded male backers. Imagine being accused of a crime, knowing you are innocent, but needing a group of respectable community members to stand by you and swear on your behalf that you are telling the truth. This was the system of compurgation, or oath helpers, a common legal practice in 780 AD. while it might sound like a communal show of support. For women facing false accusations, it was often a profound trap, largely because of who counted as a respectable community member. In a society structured around male authority and patrilineal lines, the most credible oath helpers were typically free men, landowners, and heads of households. They were the ones whose word carried weight, whose standing in the community was unquestioned. The number of oath helpers required varied depending on the severity of the accusation, sometimes as few as 3, sometimes as many as 12 or more. Each person would swear an oath, declaring their belief in the accused's innocence and effectively risking their own spiritual standing if they swore falsely. For a woman, assembling such a group of influential male compurgators was incredibly difficult. She often lacked the independent social connections that men cultivated through trade, military service, or communal gatherings. Her social sphere was typically more confined to the household. While she might have female relatives or friends, their oaths, similar to her own testimony, were often not considered as weighty or were even outright inadmissible in legal contexts. The law in many regions explicitly stated that a woman's oath helper needed to be a male relative or a man of high standing. Consider the example of a woman named Hild, accused of stealing a piece of jewelry by a local merchant. Hild is a widowed weaver, living modestly. To clear her name through compurgation, she needs perhaps 6 oath helpers. Where does she find them? Her sons might be too young or away. Her brothers might live in another village, or perhaps they have little social standing themselves. Her female neighbors, even if they trust her implicitly, might not be accepted as valid compurgators. The merchant, on the other hand, a man with business connections and male relatives, would likely find it much easier to gather his required oath helpers to support his accusation. This system effectively meant that a woman's legal defense was dependent on the goodwill and social capital of men. If she was estranged from her family, if her husband had died without leaving her a strong network, or if she simply didn't have enough male relatives of sufficient standing in the community, she was essentially left defenseless. It wasn't about whether she was innocent or guilty. It was about her ability to marshal the required male support to vouch for her. Furthermore, if a woman did manage to find male oath helpers, their willingness to swear for her could be conditional on her reputation, her perceived moral character, or even their own relationship with her male guardian. An oath helper was risking their own spiritual well-being by swearing falsely, so they would be cautious. If an accusation, even a false one, had already damaged a woman's reputation, it would be even harder to find people willing to put their own honor on the line for her. The mere whisper of an accusation, regardless of truth, could be enough to prevent her from securing the necessary backing. Compurgation, therefore, became another barrier that disproportionately impacted women. Transformed the burden of proof into a social network challenge, a challenge that women, by virtue of their societal position and legal restrictions, were almost always at a severe disadvantage to overcome. Their powerlessness stemmed not from their innocence, but from the systemic bias that ensured their word. And the word of those closest to them was not enough to save them from a false accusation. Number 6. A woman's reputation was her only shield, and it was fragile. In the year 780, and long before social media or privacy laws, your reputation was everything. It was your credit score, your social passport, and often your legal defense. For a woman, her reputation was particularly vital. It was a delicate shield that, once tarnished, offered no protection, leaving her utterly exposed to false accusations. This wasn't just about gossip. It was about the legal and social consequences that followed a damaged name. A woman's reputation was primarily tied to her chastity, her obedience, and her domestic conduct. Was she seen as virtuous? Did she run her household well? Did she do benchmarks? Any deviation, any whisper of impropriety whether true or utterly fabricated, could be devastating. A false accusation, even if eventually disproven, which was a rare feat, could leave an indelible stain. Imagine a woman named Edith, a respected healer in her village. She knows herbs and poultices, and people come to her for ailments. One day, a rival healer, perhaps a male or someone who resents her influence, spreads a rumor that Edith used her knowledge for evil, that she cursed a cow or caused a fever in a child, not by skill but by some dark magic. This is a false accusation, but it targets the core of her reputation as a beneficial presence. Immediately, fear and suspicion begin to spread. In a world steeped in superstition and communal vigilance, rumor could quickly morph into accusation. There was no formal libel law in the modern sense to protect an individual from slander. If a rumor began to circulate, fueled by malice or misunderstanding, a woman's good name could be shattered within days. Once her reputation was compromised, her ability to defend herself against subsequent or even unrelated false accusations plummeted. Why? Because her reputation affected her credibility. If she was accused of theft, and there were already whispers about her being loose or deceitful, her denials would carry less weight. If she needed oath helpers for compurgation, who would risk their own standing to vouch for someone whose name was already clouded? Community, the very people who would judge her, would already have a preconceived notion based on the damaged reputation. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of legal vulnerability. Marriage prospects, vital for a woman's social and economic security, could also be ruined. A young woman falsely accused of promiscuity, even without proof, might find herself unmarriageable, condemning her to a life of dependence or destitution. This was not merely a social slight. It was an economic death sentence in a society where a woman's livelihood was almost entirely tied to her marital status or her position within a male-headed household. Furthermore, a damaged reputation could lead to social ostracization. People might avoid her, fear her, or treat her with suspicion. This isolation meant she would have fewer allies, fewer people willing to speak up for her or offer support when she most desperately needed it. The justice system relied heavily on communal consensus and opinion. If the community already judged her based on rumor, her chances in a formal legal proceeding were severely diminished. So, while a woman might have possessed a pristine character, a lifetime of good deeds and an unblemished record, a single, malicious, false accusation could undermine all of it. Her reputation, the shield she depended on in a precarious world, was incredibly fragile. Once cracked by rumor and suspicion, it offered no defense, leaving her exposed and defenseless against the very real and often brutal consequences of a society quick to condemn and slow to forgive. The loss of her good name was often the first step towards her legal undoing, no matter how untrue the initial whisper. Number 5. Access to legal knowledge and education was a closed book. Imagine trying to fight a legal battle when you don't even understand the rules of the game, let alone the complex strategies. For women in 780, navigating the murky waters of the legal system was like trying to read a book written in a language they weren't taught, a book held out of their reach. Their limited access to legal knowledge and education rendered them profoundly powerless against false accusations. The legal systems of this era were not codified in accessible books for the common person, let alone common women. Laws were often customary passed down orally, or contained in Latin-based documents that only the educated elite, mostly male clergy and scribes, could read and interpret. There were no public defenders, no legal aid clinics, and no general education for the populace on their rights or the legal processes. Education, beyond basic domestic or agricultural skills, was largely confined to monasteries and churches, and primarily reserved for men who would become clergy or scholars. While some aristocratic women might have received rudimentary literacy, particularly those in religious orders, the vast majority of women were illiterate. This meant they could not read any existing legal documents, charters, or written judgments. They couldn't consult texts to understand the procedures of a trial, the specific requirements for proof, or the various forms of legal defense. Consider the complexity of a legal proceeding at the time. It might involve specific forms of oath-taking, knowledge of local customs, an understanding of who could serve as a witness or compurgator, and the precise rituals for an ordeal. Without literacy or direct instruction, a woman accused of a crime would be entirely dependent on others to explain these processes, and those others were often the very men who dominated the legal system and society. She might not understand the charges leveled against her, the legal terms used, or the implications of her responses. She couldn't independently verify information or challenge legal arguments. Her defense was often limited to simple denials or appeals to her character, neither of which carried much weight in a system demanding specific legal maneuvers. Imagine a woman, perhaps a common villager, accused of witchcraft, a potent and terrifying accusation that could end in death. The charges might be vague, based on local superstition or an unexplained illness. How could she possibly defend herself when she didn't understand what constituted evidence in the eyes of the accusers or the community? She couldn't study past cases, couldn't research legal precedents, and couldn't even read the biblical passages or religious texts that might be invoked against her. Her ignorance of legal procedure also made her susceptible to manipulation or intimidation. Without understanding her limited rights, she might unknowingly incriminate herself, miss an opportunity for a valid defense, or fail to challenge a flawed accusation. She relied entirely on the interpreter of the law, who might or might not have her best interests at heart. This lack of education wasn't just a personal failing, it was a systemic barrier. By denying women access to the very tools needed to understand and participate in a legal process, society ensured their powerlessness. When a false accusation struck, it was like being thrown into a maze blindfolded, without a map, and without anyone to guide her through the hidden traps. Her lack of knowledge became a silent accomplice to the false accusation, leaving her utterly vulnerable and unable to truly fight for her freedom or her life. Number 4. Economic dependence meant no financial freedom for defense. Imagine being falsely accused and having no money to hire anyone to help you, no way to travel to a distant court, and no independent means to survive if you lost your home or livelihood. For women in 780, economic dependence was a severe and often insurmountable barrier against false accusations, tying their legal fate directly to the whims and resources of others. In this era, most women had very limited, if any, independent economic power. Land ownership, the primary source of wealth and stability, was predominantly held by men. While some aristocratic women might inherit land or control dower rights, their economic power was usually tied to their male relatives or husbands. Common women worked the land, produced crafts, or managed the household. But their labor and its fruits were generally considered part of the household economy, controlled by the male head. They did not typically accumulate personal wealth or have independent access to credit or financial resources. When an accusation arose, defending oneself could be costly, even if there were no lawyers. As we know them, there were expenses. One might need to travel to a distant court, pay fees to legal officials, offer gifts to influential persons for their support, or compensate oath helpers for their time. If a trial by ordeal was required, offerings to the church or specific preparations might be needed. If a woman was accused and found guilty, she might face fines, confiscation of property, or even exile, which would render her destitute without any independent means of support. Consider a woman named Gisela, a free peasant living on a small plot of land with her husband and children. She is falsely accused of theft by a powerful lord. Her husband, if he believes her, might try to defend her, using their meager resources. But what if he doesn't believe her, What if he is intimidated by the Lord? Or what if she is a widow with no adult sons or brothers to rely on? She has no land, no savings, and no independent income stream. How does she find resources to appease officials or secure support from influential people? The answer is, she largely cannot. Her economic powerlessness extended to her inability to leave. If she were condemned to exile, or if life became untenable in her village due to a false accusation, she often had no means to pick up and start anew elsewhere. With no land, no trade that could support her independently, and no capital, she was tied to her current location and the mercy of her community, even if that community was turning against her. This economic reality meant that a woman's defense against a false accusation was often not her own, but that of her male guardian. If her father or husband refused to support her financially or lacked the means to do so, she was left utterly defenseless. Her very survival, let alone her legal freedom, was contingent on the resources and willingness of a man. If that man was her accuser, or if he simply didn't care enough, her fate was sealed. Furthermore, false accusations often targeted women who were already economically vulnerable, making them easier targets. A widow with no male protectors, a woman who owned a small piece of land independently, which was rare, or a woman engaged in a solitary trade might be seen as easy prey. Their lack of financial power meant they could not exert influence, offer bribes, or simply hold out against a powerful accuser. Their poverty was not just a social burden, it was a legal vulnerability, directly contributing to their inability to fight for justice when their name and their freedom were on the line. Number 3. Physical pulgibility made her susceptible to coercion. Imagine being accused, terrified, and then subjected to physical duress, where your body becomes a tool for extracting a confession regardless of the truth. For women, in 780, at their inherent physical vulnerability, combined with the lack of legal protections, meant they were highly susceptible to coercion and even torture during interrogations, leaving them almost powerless against false accusation. While systematic state-sanctioned torture as a standard legal practice would become more formalized in later centuries, the early medieval period was not without its brutal methods of extracting information or confessions. Interrogations could be violent, and individuals, particularly those without social standing or powerful protectors, were vulnerable. Women were often seen as physically weaker and more easily intimidated than men, making them prime targets for such tactics. Consider a woman named Freya, accused of a theft she did not commit. She might be questioned in a dark, isolated room, perhaps within a lord's castle or a monastic complex. She might be kept awake for days, denied food and water, or subjected to extreme cold or heat. While overt organized torture might not have been a universal legal norm, the threat of it, or the subtle use of physical discomfort and psychological pressure, was very real. An accusation alone, especially one with serious consequences, was enough to instill immense fear. The goal was to break the accused, to force a confession that would simplify the legal process for the accuser. For an innocent woman, exhausted and terrified, the line between denying a truth and confessing to a falsehood to escape suffering could blur. She might be told that confessing would lead to a lighter sentence, or that her torment would end if she admitted guilt. In a state of extreme distress, she might confess simply to make the ordeal stop, even if it meant condemning herself. Moreover, if a woman had already been socially ostracized due to a damaged reputation, as discussed earlier, her screams or pleas for mercy might be ignored by those around her. There was no independent oversight body, no universal concept of human rights to protect her. Her body was seen as expendable, especially if she was perceived as a transgressor. Sexual violence was also a pervasive threat that amplified a woman's vulnerability during captivity or interrogation, though often unrecorded and unpunished. The mere possibility of such abuse could be used as a threat driving a woman to confess to anything to avoid. While not explicitly part of legal procedure, the power dynamics inherent in her physical vulnerability made her exceedingly susceptible to exploitation and forced confessions. In a society where the rule of law was often intertwined with the will of powerful local figures, and where physical force was a common means of control, women lacked the physical and social defenses to withstand such pressure. Their physical vulnerability meant that an accusation, even a baseless one, could quickly escalate into a horrifying personal ordeal, with their bodies becoming the final battlefield where truth was silenced by coercion. This inherent lack of physical agency, coupled with a lack of legal protection, made them tragically powerless against false accusations, as their very bodies could be turned against them. Number 2. Patriarchal society and male guardianship meant no independent voice. In 780, that society was overwhelmingly patriarchal. This wasn't just a cultural norm, it was the bedrock of the legal and social structure. Women, regardless of their age or status, were largely seen as perpetual minors, legally under the guardianship of a male relative, a father, a husband, a brother, or even a son if she was widowed. This system of male guardianship, known as mund in some Germanic legal traditions, meant that a woman had no independent legal standing, leaving her without a voice of her own when facing a false accusation. Imagine a woman, perhaps a young wife named Bertha, accused of infidelity. This was a grave accusation, potentially leading to divorce, disinheritance, or severe punishment. Bertha knows she is innocent, but she cannot simply walk into a local court or assembly and present her case. Her husband, the Mundschuld, or guardian, is her legal representative. He is the one who must speak for her, present her defense, or even decide if a defense will be mounted at all. This system presented several critical problems for women facing false accusations. Firstly, her guardian might not believe her. A husband, swayed by rumor or personal suspicion, might choose to accept the accusation rather than defend his wife, especially if defending her would challenge a powerful figure or incur significant costs. His protection was not always guaranteed to be in her best interest. If he believed her guilty, or if it suited him to believe her guilty, perhaps to seek a new wife or avoid a dowry repayment, he could simply abandon her to her fate. Secondly, her guardian might be the accuser himself. In cases of domestic disputes, property claims, or marital problems, a husband could accuse his wife of a range of transgressions. In such a scenario, the very person legally bound to protect her was her adversary, leaving her utterly without recourse. She had no independent legal channel through which to appeal or seek justice against him. Thirdly, even if her guardian was supportive, his ability to defend her was tied to his own social standing and resources. If he was a man of little influence, or lacked the financial means to support her defense, her chances of clearing her name were diminished. His limitations became her limitations. Fourthly, a woman's actions required her guardian's permission. She could not initiate legal action, pursue a debt, or even formally make a complaint without his approval. This meant that if she was slandered or wronged, she couldn't unilaterally seek redress unless her male guardian chose to act on her behalf. This dependency extended to her ability to engage in legal proceedings herself. She could not be a witness in many cases, especially against a man, nor could she offer an oath or present evidence without her guardian's implicit or explicit consent and presence. This system of male guardianship, while intended to protect women in a harsh world, paradoxically disempowered them legally. It stripped them of their individual agency and placed their very lives and liberties at the mercy of another's will. When a false accusation struck, it wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for her guardian's belief, his willingness to act, and his capacity to protect her. Without his active and committed support, an innocent woman was left exposed and voiceless, a mere pawn in a legal game played by men, for men. Her fate was rarely truly in her own hands, making her profoundly vulnerable. Number 1. Superstition and witchcraft. Accusations were a death sentence. Imagine being accused of having supernatural powers, of causing bad luck, illness, or death with a mere thought or word. In 780, at a world steeped in Christian belief, but also pervasive pagan remnants and deeply ingrained superstition, accusations of witchcraft or sorcery were not just false claims. They were often immediate death sentences for women, leaving them absolutely powerless. This was arguably the most terrifying and inescapable form of false accusation. The early medieval period, while before the peak of the great witch hunts of later centuries, was fertile ground for such beliefs. Unexplained misfortunes, a crop failure, a sick child, a sudden death of livestock were often attributed to malevolent forces, and it was often older women, unmarried women, or those living on the fringes of society who became easy scapegoats. They were seen as other, vulnerable, and susceptible to the devil's influence. When such an accusation arose, it bypassed much of the conventional legal process. There was little need for traditional evidence, for testimony, or for compurgation in the face of what was considered an attack by spiritual evil. The evidence was often circumstantial. A neighbor's cow falling ill after an argument, a child developing a fever after being looked at strangely, or simply a general dislike or fear of the accused woman. Rumor, as discussed earlier, was deadly, and it combined lethally with widespread superstition. Consider a woman named Hilda, living in a secluded cottage known for her knowledge of herbs and her eccentric ways. When a series of misfortunes strikes the village, a plague among the pigs, a sudden storm destroying homes, fear takes hold. Someone whispers, "It's Hilda, she must be a witch." The accusation spreads like wildfire, fueled by panic and ignorance. Once accused of witchcraft, a woman was almost certainly doomed. The legal process, where it existed at all for such charges, was often swift and merciless. Trials by ordeal, particularly the ordeal of cold water, were frequently employed for witchcraft accusations, but with an even more terrifying twist. If she sank, she was innocent, but likely drowned. And if she floated, she was guilty and destined for execution. There was no real win for the accused. Church, a dominant force in this era, while attempting to suppress overt pagan practices, also contributed to the belief in demonic influence, inadvertently fueling the fear of witches. While not yet persecuting at the scale of later centuries, local clergy and powerful lords could easily interpret any unusual behavior or misfortune as signs of witchcraft, condemning women with little to no actual proof. Women accused of witchcraft were often tortured not necessarily to gain a confession to a specific crime, but to force them to reveal their supposed pact with evil or to name accomplices. Their screams and confessions, extracted under duress, were then used to justify their condemnation. There was no defense against a charge rooted in irrational fear and deeply held belief in malevolent forces. No amount of logic, no pleas of innocence could counteract the terror that an entire community might feel. The powerlessness of women facing witchcraft accusations was absolute. They were denied any semblance of justice, any opportunity for fair trial, and often any hope of survival. The accusation itself was not just a legal charge, it was a social death sentence, often followed swiftly by a physical one. In the year 780, and for a woman to be falsely accused of witchcraft was to enter a nightmare from which there was almost no awakening, making it the ultimate terrifying illustration of their vulnerability in a world governed by fear and prejudice.